The sun beat down mercilessly on the dried earth of the New Mexico territory. Thomas McCarty stood at the fence of his small ranch, watching his last horse drink from the water trough. The chestnut mare was all he had left after a brutal winter had claimed his cattle, and the bank had taken nearly everything else. His ranch, once home to 50 head of cattle and a dozen horses, now felt empty and quiet. Thomas was a man of 42 years, weathered by the harsh frontier life. His face bore the lines of someone who had seen both prosperity and loss. He had come west 15 years ago with dreams of building something lasting, something he could pass down to children he never had. His wife Sarah had died of fever 3 years back, and since then the ranch had slowly fallen apart. Without her steady hand and cheerful spirit, Thomas found it hard to care about much anymore. The mare, whom he called Rosie, was more than just a horse to him. She had been Sarah's favorite, gentle and reliable. Selling her would bring enough money to pay off his remaining debts and maybe give him a fresh start somewhere else. A cattle buyer from Santa Fe had offered him a fair price, enough to leave this place behind and start over. The man would arrive tomorrow morning to collect her. Thomas walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the dry ground. Inside, he gathered what little hay remained and brought it to Rosie. As she ate, he stroked her neck, remembering better days. The ranch house behind him needed repairs he couldn't afford. The roof leaked and the porch sagged on one side. He had tried to keep up with everything, but one man alone couldn't do it all. That afternoon, as Thomas was mending a section of fence that had come loose, he heard voices. He looked up to see two small figures walking along the dirt road that passed by his property. As they came closer, he realized they were children, Apache by the look of their clothing and dark hair. A boy and a girl, neither could have been more than 10 or 12 years old. They walked slowly, the girl leaning heavily on her brother. Thomas could see even from a distance that something was wrong. He set down his tools and walked toward them. As he approached, he saw that the girl's foot was badly swollen and her face was pale with pain. The boy looked exhausted, his lips cracked from thirst. Thomas raised his hand in greeting, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. Many settlers in these parts feared the Apache, and the feeling was mutual after years of conflict and broken treaties. But Thomas had always believed that people were just people, regardless of where they came from. The boy stopped and positioned himself protectively in front of his sister. His eyes were wary but desperate. Thomas could see the calculation happening behind those young eyes, weighing the danger of approaching a white settler against whatever need had brought them here. Thomas pointed to his canteen hanging from his belt, then to his mouth, making drinking motions. The boy hesitated, then nodded. Thomas slowly removed the canteen and held it out. The boy took it carefully, never taking his eyes off Thomas. He gave it first to his sister, who drank deeply, then took several long swallows himself. Using simple gestures and the few Apache words he had picked up over the years from trading, Thomas asked what had happened. The boy explained haltingly, mixing Apache words with broken English, that they had been traveling with their family's group when his sister had stepped on a cactus. The thorns had gone deep and the wound had become infected. They had fallen behind when she could no longer walk, and now they were lost, trying to find their way back to their people. Thomas knelt down to look at the girl's foot. It was badly infected, red and hot to the touch. She needed medical attention soon, or she could lose the foot, maybe even her life. The nearest town with a doctor was 30 miles away, a full day's ride on horseback. He looked at Rosie standing by the fence, then back at these two children who needed help. Thomas knew what he had to do, even though it meant giving up his only way out of this failing ranch. Some choices weren't really choices at all. Thomas gestured for them to follow him to the ranch house. The boy was suspicious at first, but his sister's condition left them little choice. Inside, Thomas cleared the table and helped the girl sit. He brought out his medical supplies, basic as they were. He had learned some field medicine during his years on the frontier, enough to know this infection needed more than he could provide here. He heated water and carefully cleaned the wound, removing the remaining cactus thorns he could see. The girl bit her lip to keep from crying out, and her brother held her hand tightly. Thomas applied a poultice of herbs he kept for treating his animals, then wrapped the foot in clean cloth. It was the best he could do, but he knew it wasn't enough. As the sun began to set, Thomas fed the children. They ate hungrily, probably the first real meal they had eaten in days. He showed them where they could sleep in the barn, on clean hay with blankets. The boy remained cautious, but gratitude showed in his eyes. That night, Thomas sat on his porch looking at the stars. Tomorrow, the cattle buyer would come for Rosie. The money from that sale was supposed to be his escape from this place, his chance to start fresh somewhere new. But looking at those 2 children sleeping in his barn, one of them fighting an infection that could kill her, he knew there was only one right thing to do. When morning came, Thomas woke the children and brought them breakfast. Then he went to the barn and saddled Rosie. He filled 2 water skins and packed food into the saddlebags. The boy watched him with confused eyes, not understanding what Thomas intended. Thomas led Rosie out and helped the girl onto the saddle. He drew a simple map in the dirt, showing the direction to the nearest Apache lands as best he knew them. He gave the reins to the boy and pressed the map into his hand. The boy stared at him in disbelief, then looked at his sister sitting on the valuable horse. In that moment, something passed between the man and the boy, an understanding that transcended language and culture. The boy nodded slowly with a dignity beyond his years. Thomas stepped back and watched as they rode away, the boy leading the horse carefully, his sister holding on weakly to the saddle. As they disappeared over the hill, Thomas heard the sound of a wagon approaching. The cattle buyer from Santa Fe was arriving right on time. Thomas would have to tell him the horse was no longer for sale. He would have to face his debts with empty pockets and no way forward. But as he stood there in the morning light, watching the dust settle where the children had vanished from sight, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like himself again, like the man Sarah had loved, the man who had come west believing in something better. Whatever came next, he had done the right thing. Sometimes that had to be enough. The cattle buyer was a stout man named Henderson, with a thick mustache and calculating eyes. He climbed down from his wagon with the confidence of someone who held all the cards. Thomas met him in the yard, his hat in his hands, already knowing this conversation would not go well. Henderson looked around, his eyes searching for the chestnut mare he had come to purchase. When he didn't see her, his expression turned suspicious. Thomas explained simply that the horse was no longer available. He didn't elaborate, didn't mention the 2 Apache children or the infected foot or the choice he had made at dawn. The buyer's face reddened with anger. He had traveled 2 days to get here, he said, and they had an agreement. Thomas stood firm but apologetic. He offered no excuses, just the plain fact that the horse was gone. Henderson threatened legal action, talked about contracts and consequences, but there had been no written contract, just a handshake agreement, and both men knew it. Finally, Henderson climbed back into his wagon, cursing Thomas for wasting his time and predicting the ranch would be foreclosed within a month. Thomas watched him drive away, dust rising behind the wagon wheels. The man was probably right about the foreclosure. Without the money from Rosie's sale, Thomas had no way to pay what he owed. The next few days passed slowly. Thomas worked on small repairs around the ranch, fixing things that had been neglected for too long. He cleaned out the barn, mended fences, and patched the leaking roof as best he could with what materials he had. It felt good to work with his hands again, even if he was fixing up a place he would soon lose. He thought often about the 2 children. Had they made it home safely? Was the girl's foot healing, or had the infection worsened? He would never know, and that uncertainty sat heavy in his chest. But he didn't regret his choice. Some things mattered more than money or property. On the 3rd day after the children left, a rider appeared on the horizon. Thomas was working in the vegetable garden Sarah had planted years ago, trying to coax life from plants that had been neglected too long. He stood up, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, watching the rider approach. As the figure came closer, Thomas felt a chill of recognition. The rider was Apache, a young warrior by the looks of him, sitting tall on a painted pony. Thomas's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle he had left leaning against the fence, but he stopped himself. If there was going to be trouble, one rifle wouldn't save him anyway. The warrior stopped at a respectful distance and raised his hand in greeting. Thomas did the same, his heart beating faster. The warrior spoke in Apache too quickly for Thomas to understand, but his tone didn't sound threatening. Then he switched to broken English. He had come with a message, he said. The children had arrived safely. The girl was with the medicine woman and would recover. Their father wished to meet the man who had saved his children. He would come at dawn tomorrow, and Thomas should not be afraid. Before Thomas could respond or ask questions, the warrior turned his horse and rode away, disappearing as quickly as he had come. Thomas stood in his garden, processing what he had just heard. The children's father wanted to meet him. He should not be afraid. But those words did little to calm the anxiety building in his chest. That night, Thomas barely slept. He lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the desert night, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The Apache had every right to be angry with white settlers. Years of broken treaties, stolen land, and violence had created deep wounds on both sides. Yet he had acted out of simple human decency, seeing two children in need rather than thinking about their heritage. Would the father see it that way? Or would he view Thomas as just another white man occupying Apache land? Thomas had heard stories of Apache justice, swift and final. He had also heard stories of Apache honor, of debts repaid and promises kept. He didn't know which story his life was about to become. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Thomas got up and dressed. He made coffee and sat on his porch waiting. The air was cool and still, the kind of desert morning that felt full of possibility. He didn't bring his rifle out with him. Whatever was coming, he would face it as he had made his choice, with open hands. The sun crept higher, turning the sky from gray to pink to pale blue. Thomas drank his coffee and watched the horizon. An hour passed, then another. He began to wonder if the warrior's message had been some kind of trick, or if the father had changed his mind about coming. Then he saw them. At first, it was just a disturbance in the distance, a shimmer in the morning heat. But as they came closer, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just one rider or even a handful. It was an enormous group spreading across the desert like a flood. Thomas stood up slowly, his coffee cup forgotten in his hand. He counted 20 riders, then 50, then lost count as more kept coming. They rode in loose formation, a sea of horses and warriors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The morning sun glinted off weapons and decorated shields. His first instinct was fear, pure and simple. No settler could look at 200 Apache warriors approaching and not feel their mortality pressing close. But Thomas forced himself to stand still, to keep his hands visible and empty. He had made his choice when he gave away his horse. Now he would live with whatever consequences followed. The warriors stopped about 100 yards from his ranch, forming a massive semicircle. The sight was overwhelming, powerful in a way that made Thomas understand how small he was, how fragile his little ranch and his individual life were against the sweep of history and the strength of these people. One rider separated from the group and rode forward slowly. He was a man of about Thomas's age, with streaks of gray in his long black hair. He wore the bearing of a leader, sitting his horse with natural authority. His face was weathered and strong, marked by both laughter lines and scars. As he approached, Thomas saw the boy from 3 days ago riding beside him. The same boy who had led Rosie away with his injured sister. The boy pointed at Thomas and spoke to the man, confirming this was the ranch, this was the settler who had helped them. The leader stopped his horse a respectful distance away. For a long moment, he simply looked at Thomas, his dark eyes taking in everything, the failing ranch, the lone white man standing on his porch, the empty corrals and fields going to seed. Then he spoke, his English better than his son's, but still heavily accented. His words would change everything Thomas thought he knew about his future. The ranch owner had given up his last horse to save 2 Apache children. Now it was time to see what that act of kindness had truly set in motion. Thomas stood perfectly still, every sense heightened, waiting to learn whether the dawn would bring redemption or reckoning. Behind the leader, 200 warriors waited in silence, the desert morning holding its breath around them all. The Apache leader dismounted with fluid grace, his feet touching the ground softly despite his solid build. He stood there for a moment, one hand resting on his horse's neck, studying Thomas with eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into a man's character. Thomas forced himself to breathe normally, to meet that penetrating gaze without flinching or looking away. The leader spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the morning air. He introduced himself as Nantaje, which meant, he who speaks wisely in his language. The 2 children were his, he explained, his youngest son and daughter. They had been traveling to rejoin their band after visiting relatives when the accident happened. When they failed to return, he had gathered every warrior he could find to search for them. Nantaje described the fear that had gripped his heart when his children went missing. The desert was unforgiving, and an injured child could die quickly without help. He had prepared himself for the worst, imagining all the terrible possibilities. Then his children had ridden into camp on a beautiful chestnut mare, alive and with the girl's foot properly treated. His son had told him the story of the white rancher who had given them his last horse. At first, Nantaje admitted, he had not believed the story. In his experience, white settlers did not help Apache children. They drove them away, sometimes worse. But his son insisted, and when Nantaje examined the horse, he saw it was valuable, well cared for, the kind of animal a poor man would sell to survive. This was not a cast-off or a broken-down nag. This was a sacrifice. Thomas listened, his hands hanging loose at his sides, still not sure where this conversation was headed. Nantaje took a step closer, and Thomas noticed the fine details of the man's appearance. His clothing was a mix of traditional Apache dress and practical frontier wear, decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of patience and skill. A well-worn knife hung at his belt, and a rifle rested in the saddle of his horse, but his hands remained empty and open. Nantaje explained that among his people, a life debt was sacred. Thomas had saved both his children when he could have turned them away or worse. The horse alone was a gift beyond measure, but the care, the medicine, the food and shelter, these were actions that created a bond between families. Such a debt could not be ignored or dismissed. It had to be honored properly. Thomas finally found his voice. He told Nantaje that he had only done what any decent person would do. The children needed help, and he had the means to provide it. He expected nothing in return. But even as he spoke these words, Nantaje was shaking his head. The Apache leader explained that this was exactly why the debt was so profound. Thomas had acted without thought of reward or recognition. He had given up something precious, perhaps his last valuable possession, to help children who were strangers to him. This was the definition of true generosity, and among the Apache, such actions were remembered and honored. Nantaje turned and gestured to the warriors assembled behind him. He explained that he had brought them all as witnesses to what was about to happen. In Apache culture, important promises were made before the community, so everyone could see and remember. What he was about to offer Thomas was witnessed by 200 men, who would carry the story back to their people. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. The sheer formality of the moment made him understand this was something significant, though he still couldn't imagine what Nantaje intended. The Apache leader called his son forward. The boy rode up, and Thomas recognized the same wariness mixed with gratitude he had seen days before. But now there was something else in the young face: pride. Nantaje spoke to his son in Apache, and the boy nodded seriously. Then Nantaje turned back to Thomas. He explained that his son would spend the next year learning from Thomas if Thomas would have him. The boy would work on the ranch, learning the ways of horses and cattle, of farming and building. This would teach him skills valuable for his people's survival in the changing world. But more than that, it would allow the boy to repay in service what Thomas had given in kindness. Thomas started to protest that this wasn't necessary, but Nantaje held up his hand. There was more, he said. Thomas's ranch was failing. This was obvious to anyone with eyes. The fields were neglected, the buildings in disrepair, the corrals empty. One man alone could not maintain such a place, especially one who had given away his last horse. Nantaje gestured broadly to the assembled warriors. For the next month, he announced, his warriors would help restore the ranch. They would repair buildings, mend fences, clear fields. They would work as payment for the debt owed. This was not charity, Nantaje emphasized. This was honor. This was justice in the Apache way. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He had expected nothing, hoped for nothing. He had made his choice and accepted the consequences. But now, standing in his dusty yard with an Apache leader offering help he desperately needed, he felt overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of it. But Nantaje was not finished. He turned to several warriors near the front of the group and called them forward. They rode up leading a string of horses, at least a dozen beautiful animals. These, Nantaje explained, were a gift to replace the one Thomas had given away. Among them was Rosie, the chestnut mare, groomed and healthy, wearing a new bridle decorated with intricate leather work. Thomas couldn't speak. He walked down from his porch and approached Rosie slowly, his hand reaching out to stroke her familiar neck. She nickered in recognition, pushing her soft nose against his chest. He had thought he would never see her again, had made peace with that loss. Now here she was, returned to him along with horses enough to start rebuilding his herd. Nantaje watched this reunion with satisfaction. He explained that his daughter was healing well, thanks to Thomas's initial treatment. The medicine woman had been able to save the foot because Thomas had cleaned it properly and prevented the infection from spreading further. His daughter would walk normally again, would run and dance and live a full life. How could such a debt ever be truly repaid? Thomas turned to Nantaje, tears unashamedly running down his weathered face. He tried to express his gratitude, but words felt inadequate. Nantaje smiled, the first smile Thomas had seen from him, and it transformed his stern face into something warm and almost paternal. The Apache leader explained that starting tomorrow, warriors would arrive each day to work on the ranch. They would bring tools and materials, knowledge and strong backs. Thomas's only job was to guide them, to show them what needed doing. By the end of the month, this ranch would be whole again. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Nantaje gave orders in Apache, and the assembled warriors began to disperse, riding away in small groups. But many remained, already dismounting and examining the ranch with the practical eyes of men ready to work. Some walked toward the barn, others toward the sagging fences. Others surveyed the ranch house with its leaking roof. Nantaje's son remained as well, tending to the string of horses. Thomas watched the boy work, efficient and knowledgeable beyond his years. This was the beginning of something unexpected, a bridge built between two worlds that had been at war for so long. Thomas invited Nantaje into his house for coffee, a gesture of hospitality that the Apache leader accepted graciously. As they sat at Thomas's worn kitchen table drinking strong black coffee, they began to talk. Not about the debt or the work to be done, but about simpler things, about horses and weather, about the changing land and what it meant for both their peoples. For the first time since Sarah's death, Thomas felt something like hope stirring in his chest. His ranch would survive. More than that, he had made an unexpected friend, formed an unlikely alliance. The future suddenly looked different than it had just days before, when he had been preparing to sell his last horse and abandon his dreams. The first full day of work began before sunrise. Thomas woke to the sound of horses and voices outside his window. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch to find 30 Apache warriors already assembled in his yard, along with Nantaje and his son. The warriors had brought tools, ropes, lumber salvaged from an abandoned settler's cabin, and bundles of dried grass for thatching. Nantaje greeted Thomas with a nod and explained the plan. He had divided the warriors into groups, each with a specific task. Some would work on the barn, which was listing dangerously to one side. Others would repair the corrals and fences. A third group would tackle the ranch house roof before the next rain came. The remaining men would clear the irrigation ditches that had become clogged with debris, essential for getting water to the fields. Thomas was amazed at the organization and efficiency. These were fighting men, warriors accustomed to raids and battles, yet they approached the work with the same discipline and focus they would bring to any important mission. Nantaje explained that Apache men were not just warriors. They were hunters, builders, craftsmen. A man who could not provide for his family or repair his dwelling was not much of a man, regardless of his courage in battle. The work began in earnest. Thomas moved between the groups, offering guidance but mostly staying out of the way, as the Apache men demonstrated skills he had underestimated. They worked with a coordination that came from years of depending on each other for survival. When one man needed help lifting a heavy beam, 2 others were there before he had to ask. When someone's tool broke, another appeared with a replacement. Nantaje's son, whose name Thomas learned was Koda, meaning friend in Apache, stayed close to Thomas throughout the day. The boy asked questions constantly, wanting to know about everything. How deep should fence posts be set? What kind of wood lasted longest in this climate? How did you train a horse to work with cattle? Thomas found himself enjoying the role of teacher, explaining things he had learned through years of hard experience. By midday, the progress was remarkable. The barn stood straight again, reinforced with new supports and crossbeams. The worst sections of fencing had been replaced, and the corrals looked sturdy enough to hold horses safely. On the roof, men worked steadily, replacing rotten shingles and patching holes that had let rain pour into Thomas's house for 2 winters. Thomas prepared a simple lunch of beans, bread and dried meat, everything he had in his pantry. He worried it wouldn't be enough to feed so many men, but the warriors shared what they had brought as well. Dried venison, corn cakes, roasted pine nuts, and water from clean skins. They ate together in the shade of the barn, and Thomas listened to the conversations flowing around him in Apache, understanding none of the words but recognizing the rhythm of men sharing a meal after hard work. Nantaje sat beside Thomas and spoke about the changing times. He admitted that he saw the future coming, whether his people wanted it or not. More settlers were arriving every year, claiming land that had belonged to the Apache since time beyond memory. There had been violence, would likely be more violence, but Nantaje believed his people needed to learn new skills to survive in a world that was transforming around them. This was partly why he had brought so many warriors, Nantaje explained. Yes, to witness the payment of a debt, but also to learn. Many of his men were watching carefully, seeing how Thomas's ranch was structured, understanding how white settlers managed land and animals. This knowledge might help the Apache adapt and survive, not by giving up their identity, but by adding new tools to their traditional ways. Thomas understood the weight of what Nantaje was sharing. This was more than repaying a debt. This was a bridge between 2 peoples who had been enemies, built on the foundation of 2 children and 1 man's simple act of kindness. He felt the responsibility of it, the importance of treating this moment with the respect it deserved. The afternoon brought new challenges. The irrigation ditches had been neglected for years, and clearing them was backbreaking work. Thomas joined this crew, working alongside Apache warriors in the hot sun. They dug in silence mostly, but occasionally someone would point out a better technique or a more efficient angle for the shovel. Thomas realized he was learning as much as he was teaching. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Thomas surveyed what had been accomplished in just 1 day. The transformation was astounding. His ranch looked alive again, purposeful. Buildings stood straight, fences were tight, and water was beginning to flow through the cleared irrigation channels. The warriors prepared to leave for their camp a few miles away, gathering their tools and horses. But Nantaje announced that 10 men would stay each night, rotating shifts to guard the ranch while work continued. Thomas protested that this wasn't necessary, that he had never been afraid to stay alone. But Nantaje was firm. The ranch now held valuable horses and tools. More importantly, until the debt was fully paid, Thomas was under Apache protection. To harm him would be to insult Nantaje's honor. That night, after the main group had ridden away, Thomas sat around a small fire with Koda and the 10 warriors who had stayed. They shared a meal and stories, though the language barrier made communication challenging. But somehow, through gestures and the few words they shared in common, they managed to understand each other. One warrior demonstrated how to make a particular type of knot useful for securing loads. Another showed Thomas a method for treating rope to make it last longer in the desert sun. Koda translated when he could, his young voice bridging the gap between languages. Thomas learned the names of the men around the fire. There was Goyakla, whose name meant one who yawns, though he was the most energetic of the group. There was Cochise, named after the great leader, living up to his name with quiet dignity. There was Naiche, which meant the mischievous one, and he was constantly making jokes that had the others laughing. As the fire burned down to embers, Thomas felt a contentment he hadn't experienced in years. His body ached from the day's labor, but it was the good ache of productive work. His ranch was being reborn around him. He had friends, or at least allies, where he had expected to have nothing. The loneliness that had plagued him since Sarah's death felt less heavy tonight. Koda stayed close to Thomas, asking more questions even as the evening grew late. The boy wanted to know about Thomas's life, about how he came to be here, about his wife, and why there were no children. Thomas found himself talking about Sarah, something he rarely did anymore. He described her laughter, her strength, her belief in the goodness of people. He explained how she had died and how he had lost his way after that. The boy listened with a solemnity beyond his years. Then he said something that surprised Thomas. He said that his mother believed Thomas had been sent by the spirits to save her children. She believed that Thomas's wife was watching over him still, guiding him to do good things even though he was sad and alone. Coda said his mother wanted to meet Thomas to thank him properly in the Apache way. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes at this unexpected kindness. The idea that Sarah might still be somehow present, guiding him, brought comfort he hadn't known he needed. He thanked Coda for sharing his mother's words and promised he would be honored to meet her when the time was right. As the stars filled the sky above them, brilliant in the clear desert air, Thomas lay in his bed listening to the quiet sounds of the Apache warriors keeping watch outside. For the first time in years, he felt truly safe, not just physically but in some deeper way. He had been saved by the very act of saving others, rescued from his despair by the family he had helped without expecting anything in return. Tomorrow would bring more work, more progress, more opportunities to learn and teach. But tonight, Thomas simply rested in the knowledge that sometimes the world surprised you. Sometimes kindness was repaid 100-fold. Sometimes enemies became friends over a shared fire and honest work. And sometimes, when you gave away your last horse to help children in need, you received back more than you had ever imagined possible. The second week of work brought unexpected visitors. 3 white settlers from the nearest town rode up to Thomas's ranch, their faces showing suspicion and concern. They had heard rumors about Apache warriors working on the McCarty place and had come to investigate. The lead writer was James Crawford, who owned the general store and considered himself a spokesman for the settler community. Thomas met them at the boundary of his property. Aware of the Apache warriors working behind him on various projects, Crawford didn't bother with pleasantries. He demanded to know what Thomas was thinking, allowing hostile Indians onto his land. Did he not remember the raids from 5 years back? Did he not care about the safety of his neighbors? Thomas kept his voice calm but firm. He explained what had happened with the children, the debt of honor that Nantaje felt, and the agreement they had made. The Apache were here to work, nothing more. They had caused no trouble and had actually been remarkably helpful. His ranch was being restored, and he was grateful for the assistance. Crawford's face reddened with anger. He called Thomas a fool and a traitor to his own people. He said the Apache couldn't be trusted, that this was probably some elaborate trick to scout settler defenses or plan an attack. The other 2 settlers nodded in agreement, their hands resting conspicuously on their holstered pistols. Before Thomas could respond, Nantaje emerged from the barn where he had been supervising repairs. He walked toward them with measured steps, projecting authority without aggression. Crawford and his companions tensed, hands moving closer to their weapons, but Nantaje simply stopped a respectful distance away and addressed them in clear English. He explained the situation as Thomas had, but added something Thomas had not known. His band was not at war with the settlers currently. They had been peaceful for 3 years, trying to coexist despite the tensions. He acknowledged that there had been violence in the past on both sides, wrongs committed that could not be forgotten. But he asked whether punishing a man for helping children was the kind of justice white people believed in. Crawford had no good answer to that. He blustered about protocols and safety, but his moral ground had been undermined. Nantaje pressed his advantage gently. He invited Crawford and his companions to inspect the work being done, to see for themselves that this was exactly what it appeared to be, men helping a neighbor who had shown kindness to their family. Reluctantly, Crawford agreed. Thomas led them around the property, showing them the repairs to the barn, the rebuilt corrals, the cleared irrigation ditches. The Apache warriors worked steadily, largely ignoring the visitors focused on their tasks. Crawford couldn't deny the quality of the work or the genuine improvement to the ranch. As they walked, Thomas talked about practical matters. He explained that having a functioning ranch here actually increased security for all the settlers. An abandoned property could become a hideout for outlaws, or a marker of retreat that encouraged more land claims. A thriving ranch was a sign of commitment to the territory, regardless of who had helped build it. Crawford left without apologizing, but his hostility had diminished. As he and his companions rode away, he called back a warning that he would be watching the situation closely. Thomas accepted this, knowing it was the best outcome he could expect. Not friendship, but at least a grudging tolerance. After the settlers left, Nantaje approached Thomas with a serious expression. He warned that more trouble might come from the white community. Fear and old hatreds ran deep on both sides. Thomas needed to be prepared for hostility, perhaps even attempts to drive the Apache away or damage what they were building together. Thomas acknowledged the risk, but said he would not send the Apache away because his neighbors were afraid. He had made a choice to help 2 children, and he would stand by the consequences of that choice, good and bad. Nantaje nodded with approval, his respect for Thomas deepening. That afternoon, Kota asked Thomas to teach him about training horses. They went to the corral where several of the gifted horses grazed. Thomas explained his philosophy, which was built on patience and trust rather than breaking a horse's spirit. He showed Kota how to approach a horse calmly, how to read the animal's body language, how to establish communication before attempting any control. Kota absorbed everything like dry earth soaking up water. The boy had natural talent with animals. Thomas could see that immediately. His movements were fluid and confident, his touch gentle but firm. Within an hour, Kota had a young mare eating from his hand and accepting a halter without resistance. Thomas found himself genuinely enjoying the teaching, remembering why he had come west in the first place. The simple satisfaction of working with horses and watching someone learn. As the days passed, the ranch continued its transformation. The main house roof was completely repaired and waterproofed. The barn received new doors and a reinforced loft for storing hay. The corrals were expanded to hold more horses comfortably. The fields were cleared, plowed, and prepared for planting. Thomas had never seen such rapid progress, and he knew he could never have accomplished even a fraction of this work alone. But more than the physical improvements, something else was growing. Genuine friendships were forming between Thomas and several of the Apache warriors. Koyakla taught Thomas how to track animals by reading signs most people would miss. Cochise showed him a method for preserving meat that lasted longer than Thomas's usual techniques. Naiche made him laugh with elaborate stories told half in Apache and half in broken English, with generous use of gestures to bridge the language gap. Thomas reciprocated by sharing his knowledge. He taught them about crop rotation and soil preparation. He demonstrated techniques for shoeing horses that prevented lameness. He explained the basics of reading and writing, something several of the younger warriors showed keen interest in learning. In quiet moments, they would gather around him as he drew letters in the dirt, practicing sounds and simple words. One evening, as the 3rd week of work neared its end, Nantaje told Thomas that his wife would visit tomorrow. She wanted to meet the man who had saved her children and to properly thank him. Thomas should prepare to receive guests with honor, Nantaje advised. This was an important moment in Apache custom. Thomas spent the evening cleaning his house more thoroughly than he had in years. He prepared what food he had, wishing he had more to offer. Kota helped him, explaining some of the protocols Thomas should observe. Don't touch the Apache women without invitation. Accept any gifts with both hands and sincere gratitude. Share food generously, but don't press if someone declines. The next morning, Nantaje arrived with his family. His wife, whose name was Desba, meaning goes to war, was a striking woman with intelligent eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. She carried herself with dignity and strength. Beside her rode their daughter, the girl Thomas had helped, now walking without a limp and looking healthy and strong. Desba dismounted and approached Thomas directly, something Kota had told him was unusual. Apache women typically let men handle formal interactions with outsiders, but Desba looked at Thomas with such intensity that he felt she was measuring his soul. Then she did something that surprised everyone. She embraced him briefly, a gesture of genuine affection that transcended cultural boundaries. Through Nantaje's translation, Desba spoke from her heart. She said that a mother's love for her children was fiercer than any warrior's courage. When her children were missing, she had felt a fear that consumed everything else. When they returned safely, riding a beautiful horse and telling a story of kindness from a white rancher, she had wept with relief and gratitude. She said that Thomas was now family, bound to them by ties stronger than blood. She presented Thomas with gifts she had made herself. A beautifully woven blanket with patterns that told a story, a pair of moccasins stitched with incredible detail, a leather pouch containing sacred herbs, and a small stone she said would bring protection. Thomas accepted each gift with both hands as Kota had instructed, feeling the weight of what they represented. The daughter, whose name was Ishta, meaning strong, stepped forward shyly. She was perhaps 14 years old at that awkward age between childhood and womanhood. She showed Thomas her foot, completely healed, and demonstrated by dancing a few quick steps. Her face glowed with happiness and health. She thanked Thomas in careful English, words she had clearly practiced, and presented him with a small carved figure of a horse she had made herself. Thomas felt his emotions rising again. He knelt down to Ishta's level and told her he was glad she was well, that her father was a man of great honor, and that he hoped she would have a long and happy life. The girl smiled brilliantly and hugged him quickly, before darting back to her mother's side. They shared a meal together, sitting in Thomas's modest house that now felt warm and alive with guests. Desba had brought food as well, traditional Apache dishes that Thomas had never tasted. There was acorn bread, roasted agave hearts, stew with rabbit and wild onions, and a sweet drink made from mesquite pods. The flavors were different from anything Thomas was accustomed to, but delicious in their own right. As they ate, conversation flowed more easily. Nantage's family told stories about their life, the places they traveled with the seasons, the challenges of maintaining their traditions in a changing world. Thomas shared stories about Sarah, about the dreams they had held for this ranch, about the loneliness of losing her. He found comfort in the sharing, in being heard by people who listened with genuine compassion. Desba said something to her husband in Apache, and Nantage translated carefully. She wanted Thomas to know that his wife's spirit was strong and good. Desba could sense such things, she said, and Sarah was pleased with what Thomas had done. She was proud of him for choosing kindness over bitterness, for helping children who needed him. This would bring peace to Sarah's spirit and healing to Thomas's heart. Thomas didn't know if he believed in such things, but hearing the words brought him comfort nonetheless. Perhaps Sarah would be proud of him. Perhaps she was watching somehow. Or perhaps these were just kind words from a grateful mother. Either way, they helped ease an ache he had carried for 3 long years. The final week of work arrived with a sense of bittersweet anticipation. Thomas had grown accustomed to the daily rhythm of dozens of Apache warriors arriving at dawn, the sounds of construction and repair, the evening fires where stories were shared. The ranch had been completely transformed, looking better than it had even in the early days when Sarah was alive, and they were full of hope. Nantage gathered everyone on the last Monday morning to explain the final tasks. The warriors would complete the remaining work on the storage shed, finish the new chicken coop Thomas had requested, and plant the fields with seeds they had brought from their own stores. By week's end, the debt would be considered paid, though the friendship would continue. Thomas worked alongside them with renewed energy, wanting to contribute as much as possible to these final projects. He had learned so much over the past month, not just practical skills but deeper lessons about honor, community, and the possibility of peace between people who seemed destined to be enemies. That afternoon, unexpected visitors arrived again, but this time they were different. A wagon rolled up carrying an older couple Thomas recognized as the Hendersons, who owned a large ranch 20 miles north. Behind them rode a younger man and woman, settlers Thomas had seen in town but never met. They approached cautiously, but without the hostility Crawford had shown. Mrs. Henderson spoke first, her voice kind but curious. She had heard about what was happening at the McCarty Ranch, and she wanted to see for herself. Her husband had done business with Apache traders for years, and believed coexistence was possible if both sides showed respect. They had brought supplies as a gesture of support, including flour, sugar, coffee, and seed for next year's planting. Thomas was deeply moved by this unexpected kindness from his own community. He introduced the Hendersons to Nantage, and the two men shook hands with genuine respect. Mrs. Henderson spoke with Desba, who had come that day to help prepare a feast for the workers. The women found ways to communicate despite the language barrier, sharing smiles and gestures of mutual recognition. The younger couple explained they were newlyweds who had just claimed land east of Thomas's property. They had been uncertain about their prospects until hearing about Thomas's situation. If an Apache band was willing to help rebuild a ranch and form peaceful partnerships, perhaps the territory wasn't as dangerous as everyone claimed. They wanted to learn from Thomas's experience and possibly establish their own good relations with the local Apache. Nantage listened to all of this with careful attention. He later told Thomas that this was an important development. If more settlers were willing to treat the Apache as potential neighbors, rather than inevitable enemies, there might be hope for lasting peace in the region. Violence bred violence, but respect could breed cooperation. Over the next few days, several more settler families came to visit, drawn by curiosity and varying degrees of goodwill. Some remained suspicious, but most seemed genuinely interested in the possibility of peaceful coexistence. Thomas found himself in the unexpected role of mediator, helping facilitate conversations between people who had viewed each other as threats for so long. Coda proved invaluable during these visits, translating and helping bridge cultural misunderstandings. The boy had blossomed during his time at the ranch, growing more confident and skilled. Thomas had taught him extensively about horses, farming, and ranch management. In return, Coda had taught Thomas about Apache customs, tracking, and survival skills that white settlers often overlooked. On the final Wednesday of work, disaster nearly struck. One of the younger Apache warriors, a hothead named Talaco, got into an argument with a settler who had come to trade some tools. The settler made a careless comment about Indians being thieves, and Talaco took offense. Words escalated quickly and both men reached for their weapons. Thomas moved faster than he thought possible, stepping between them with his hands raised. He spoke firmly to both men, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect from both communities. He told the settler that his comment was ignorant and insulting, that these Apache warriors had worked for weeks without taking anything that wasn't freely given. He told Talaco that violence would destroy everything they had built together, that true strength meant controlling anger rather than surrendering to it. Nantaje appeared beside Thomas, adding his own stern words in Apache. The moment hung on a knife's edge, both men breathing hard, anger coloring their faces. Then Talaco lowered his weapon and stepped back, though his eyes still blazed with fury. The settler, shamed by Thomas's words, mumbled an apology and left quickly. After the settler departed, Nantaje spoke seriously with Talaco, while the other warriors gathered around. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he recognized a leader reminding his people why they were here and what was at stake. Talaco eventually nodded, his shoulders dropping in acceptance of the correction. He approached Thomas later and apologized in halting English, acknowledging that his pride had nearly ruined something important. Thomas accepted the apology and shared his own story of times when anger had gotten the better of him. He explained that controlling strong emotions was one of the hardest things a man could do, but also one of the most important. Talaco listened respectfully, and Thomas saw maturity replacing the hot-blooded youth in his eyes. The incident, though frightening in the moment, actually strengthened the bonds between everyone involved. It had tested their commitment to peace and proven that they could navigate conflict without resorting to violence. Word of how Thomas and Nantaje had handled the situation spread to both communities, earning respect from many who had been skeptical. On Thursday evening, Nantaje announced that Friday would be a day of celebration rather than work. The ranch was complete, the debt was paid, and it was time to mark the occasion properly. He invited Thomas to bring any settler friends who wished to come and witness the formal conclusion of their agreement. Thomas sent word to the Hendersons and several other families who had shown friendship. That night he barely slept, thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in just 1 month. He had gone from a broken man preparing to abandon his dreams to someone with a thriving ranch, genuine friends from 2 cultures, and a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Friday dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect desert morning that reminded people why they had come to this harsh but magnificent land. Apache families began arriving early, not just warriors but women, children, and elders. They came in their finest clothing, bringing food and gifts, treating this as the significant cultural event it was. The settler families arrived more cautiously, but they came. The Hendersons brought their grown children and grandchildren. The young newlywed couple came, their eyes wide at seeing so many Apache gathered peacefully. Even a few of the more neutral townspeople came, curious despite their reservations. Desba and several Apache women had prepared an enormous feast, combining traditional Apache foods with dishes they knew settlers enjoyed. Mrs. Henderson and other settler women contributed their own cooking, creating a spread that represented both cultures working together. Long tables were set up in the yard and everyone was invited to eat together. The meal was remarkable not for the food alone, though it was delicious, but for the sight of Apache and settlers sitting side by side, sharing stories through translation and gesture, finding common ground in laughter and the universal language of good food. Children played together, initially shy but quickly overcoming their hesitations. The adults watched with cautious hope, seeing in the children's easy friendship a possibility their generation struggled to imagine. After the meal, Nantaje stood and called for attention. The crowd quieted and Thomas felt all eyes turned toward the Apache leader. Nantaje spoke in both Apache and English, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. He recounted the story of his missing children, Thomas's kindness and the debt that had brought them all together. He spoke of honor and respect, of the possibility of peace between people who chose understanding over fear. Then Nantaje called Thomas forward and presented him with a final gift, a beautiful saddle that had been crafted by the band's best leather worker. It was decorated with intricate patterns that told the story of what had happened, a permanent record of the friendship between Thomas McCarty and Nantaje's family. The saddle would last for decades, Nantaje said, and would remind future generations that peace was possible when people chose kindness. Thomas accepted the saddle with trembling hands, overcome by emotion. He tried to speak to express what the past month had meant to him, but words failed him. Instead, he simply embraced Nantaje, an action that brought approving sounds from both Apache and settlers watching. It was a gesture that transcended culture, a human moment of genuine connection. When Thomas finally found his voice, he spoke from the heart. He said that a month ago he had been a broken man with nothing left to lose. He had given away his last horse expecting nothing in return, simply because it was the right thing to do. What he had received back was so much more than horses or a repaired ranch. He had received friendship, purpose, and hope for a future he thought had died with his wife. He looked around at the gathered crowd, Apache and settlers standing together on his land, and said this was what the frontier could be. Not a place of endless conflict and bloodshed, but a place where different people learned from each other and built something new together. His ranch stood as proof that cooperation was possible, that old hatreds could be overcome by simple acts of human decency. Several people in the crowd wiped tears from their eyes, moved by Thomas's words and the sincerity with which he spoke them. Even some of the more skeptical settlers seemed affected, reconsidering positions they had held for years. Henderson stood up and announced that he wanted to follow Thomas's example. He invited Nantaje and any of his people to trade at his ranch, promising fair prices and honest dealing. He challenged other settlers to do the same, to treat the Apache as neighbors rather than enemies. Several other ranchers and farmers stood to voice similar commitments. Nantaje responded with equal generosity. He pledged that his band would respect settler property, that they would seek trade rather than taking what they needed, that they would help any settler who showed them friendship. He acknowledged that some of his people would resist this path, just as some settlers would cling to old hatreds, but he committed to working toward peace with those who desired it. The gathering continued into the evening, with music and dancing from both cultures. Some Apache warriors demonstrated traditional dances, their movements telling stories of hunts and battles and spiritual journeys. A settler with a fiddle played folk songs from back east and people clapped along regardless of their heritage. The children invented games that mixed Apache and settler traditions, creating something entirely new. As the sun set and fires were lit against the cooling desert night, Thomas found himself sitting with Nantaje, Koda, and several others from both communities. They talked about practical matters, planning future trades and cooperative ventures. Henderson suggested that Apache hunters could sell game to settlers who lacked hunting skills. Nantaje proposed that Apache women could trade their superior basket weaving and leather goods for settler cloth and metal tools. Young Koda would continue staying with Thomas. They decided at least for another year. The arrangement benefited everyone. Koda would learn valuable skills. Thomas would have help running the now thriving ranch, and the ongoing connection would reinforce the peaceful relationship between the communities. Ishta, fully recovered and energetic, announced that she wanted to learn from settler women as well, particularly their methods of preserving food and sewing with cloth. As the celebration wound down and families began departing, Thomas stood on his porch watching them go. Apache and settlers left together in small mixed groups, talking and laughing, making plans to visit each other. It was a scene he would have thought impossible just a month earlier. Nantaje was among the last to leave. He clasped Thomas's forearm in the warrior's grip and told him that their friendship would endure for life. Whatever challenges came, whatever conflicts might arise in the future, their two families would stand together. Thomas returned the grip and the sentiment, knowing he had found something rare and precious. Koda remained behind, helping Thomas clean up after the celebration. As they worked, the boy talked excitedly about everything he had learned and everything he still wanted to learn. His enthusiasm reminded Thomas of himself as a young man, full of dreams and energy. Thomas realized that in teaching Coda, he was passing on not just skills but a legacy, a way of approaching the world with openness and determination. That night, sleeping in his repaired house on his restored ranch, Thomas thought about the strange journey his life had taken. One desperate choice made in a moment of compassion for two suffering children had changed everything. It had saved his ranch, given him friends and purpose, and perhaps even helped change the future of an entire region. He thought about Sarah and wished she could see what had grown from that single decision to help. She would have loved Desba and Ishta, would have welcomed Coda like the son they never had, would have embraced the possibility of peace between cultures. Perhaps she was seeing it somehow, her spirit watching over him as Desba had suggested. The thought brought comfort as he drifted toward sleep. The months that followed proved the durability of what had been built. Coda became an integral part of the ranch, learning quickly and working hard. Thomas taught him everything he knew about horses, and Coda's natural talent flourished under guidance. Together they began breeding and training horses that became known throughout the territory for their quality. Trade between the Apache band and settler community grew steadily. Nantaji's people brought game, leather goods, and medicinal herbs to exchange for tools, cloth, and other manufactured items. The transactions were fair and friendly, building trust with each exchange. Some settlers remained hostile, and some Apache continued to raid and resist, but a growing middle ground of cooperation was emerging. Thomas's ranch became a meeting place, neutral ground where both cultures felt welcome. People came to trade, to settle disputes peacefully, to learn from each other. Thomas found himself in the unexpected role of mediator and advisor, respected by both communities for his fairness and his willingness to understand different perspectives. Within a year, 3 more settler families had established peaceful relationships with Apache bands, following the model Thomas and Nantaje had created. The region didn't become a paradise, conflicts still arose, but there was now a framework for resolving them without automatic violence. The possibility of coexistence, once dismissed as naive fantasy, had become demonstrable reality. Ishta visited often, learning from both Thomas and the settler women who came to the ranch. She became a bridge between cultures, translating not just language but customs and expectations. Her bright spirit and quick intelligence won over even some of the more resistant settlers, proving that Apache children were not so different from their own. 2 years after that fateful day when Thomas gave away his last horse, he stood in his thriving ranch watching Coda work with a young stallion. The boy, now nearly a man, had completely mastered the training techniques Thomas had taught him and had added innovations of his own, combining Apache methods with settler approaches to create something superior to either alone. Nantaje rode up that afternoon, accompanied by several warriors and his family. They had come, he explained, to mark the anniversary of the day that changed so many lives. Desba brought food and they shared another meal together, this one quiet and intimate compared to the great celebration of 2 years before. As they ate, Nantaje told Thomas that the story of the ranch owner and the Apache children had spread far beyond their region. Other tribes and other settler communities were talking about it, some with hope, others with skepticism. But the story existed now, proof that another way was possible. Thomas looked around at the faces of his friends, these people who had become family. He thought about the desperate man he had been, preparing to sell his last horse and abandon his dreams. That man had been saved by choosing compassion over despair, by seeing 2 children who needed help rather than potential enemies. The greatest treasure, Thomas realized, was not the restored ranch or the successful horse breeding operation, or even the personal friendships. Though he valued all these things deeply, the greatest treasure was the hope represented by young people like Coda and Ishta, who would grow up knowing that cooperation was possible, that people from different backgrounds could build something together. As the sun set on another beautiful desert evening, Thomas felt at peace. His life had purpose again, his days were full of meaningful work, and he was surrounded by people who cared about him. Sarah would be proud, he thought, of the man he had become through hardship and the unexpected grace of being given a chance to help others. The ranch stood as a monument to a simple truth that both cultures had known but sometimes forgotten. Kindness created ripples that spread far beyond the initial act. One desperate choice in a moment of compassion had changed dozens of lives, had altered the trajectory of an entire region, had proved that peace was possible when people chose it. Thomas picked up his coffee cup and raised it in a toast to his friends, to the children who had brought them together, to the future they were building one day at a time. Nantaje raised his own cup in response, and their eyes met with perfect understanding. They had found something rare in a violent world, genuine friendship across the divide that was supposed to separate them forever. The story of the ranch owner and the Apache children would be told for generations, growing and changing with each telling but always carrying the same essential truth. Sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply choose kindness when fear would have been easier, and sometimes that single choice could change the world.